Welcome students to the lecture on topic Life and Works of Karl Marx. In this lecture, we will discuss life and works of Karl Marx in detail, the intellectual influences on Karl Marx, the evolution and the development of Marx's political and intellectual life, his lifelong intellectual and political partnership with angels. And finally, we will discuss various themes covered in the major writings of Marx, whether done individually or in partnership with angels. Dear students, Karl Heinrich Marx is regarded as one of the greatest and the most influential thinkers of all times. He was born on May 5, 1818, in a well-off family in Trier, Prussia. He was one of the 9 children born to his parents. His father, Henrietta Marx, was a successful lawyer who had been influenced by the teaching and philosophy of Kant and Voltaire. He was a passionate activist for Prussian reform. Although both of his parents were of Jewish origin, Marx's father converted to Christianity in 1816. When Karl Marx was 6, he was baptized as a Protestant rather than a Catholic. Protestantism is the religion or religious system of any of the churches of Western Christendom that are separated from the Roman Catholic Church and adheres substantially to the principles established by Martin Luther that took shape of the Protestant Church. Marx was an average student. He was educated at home until he was 12 and spent 5 years from 1830 to 1835 at the Jesuit High School in Trier. In October of 1835, Marx joined the University of Bonn for higher studies. It had a lively and radical culture, and Marx enthusiastically took part in student life. In his 2 semesters there, he had somewhat an eventful life. At the end of the year, Marx's father insisted he enroll in the more serious University of Berlin. In Berlin, he studied law and philosophy and was introduced to the philosophy of Hegel, who had been a professor at Berlin until his death in 1831. Marx became involved with the young Hegelians, a radical group of students who criticized the political and religious establishments of the day. The young Hegelians were an intellectual group whose common theme was the ongoing application of Hegel's dialectical method rather than acceptance of Hegel's philosophical conclusions. On completing his doctorate in ancient Greek philosophy from Berlin University, he wanted to join academic career. But in spite his interest, Marx, one of the great minds of the world, failed to get a teaching position in any university. Therefore, he had to depend on journalism for his livelihood. He became the editor of a German newspaper, Rheinische Zeitung. When the government banned the newspaper, he moved to Paris. He wrote some poetry also. Marx mostly lived a life of exile, poverty and hard work, and devoted his energy on studying, writing and developing his philosophy. As a great and influential thinker, Karl Marx has even influenced those who are otherwise critical of him. He developed his philosophy in the context of the 19th century Europe. The 19th century has been characterized as the age of revolution by the eminent historian Eric Hobsbawm. Marx was influenced by and wrote in the context of the revolutionary changes that were taking place in the socio-economic and political life of Europe. To that extent, he was a product of his times. But as a great thinker, he rose above his times and dealt with issues and concerns in his philosophy that has meaning and relevance beyond his times. It is for this that more than a century after his death, he continues to have intellectual and practical relevance. The contribution of Karl Marx is spread over various social sciences such as economics, politics, sociology, social psychology, and history. He is most important among thinkers who brought to light the exploitation, alienation, and dehumanization present in the social, economic, and political organization of the modern society. Marx is also the revolutionary thinker who sought a way of changing this situation, and what is more important, tried to put his ideas into practice. Hence, his ideas have great significance for social scientists. By his time, Industrial Revolution had taken over large parts of Europe. Because of this, individual manual labor is replaced by mechanized mass production and craftsmen are replaced by assembly lines. Industrialization is most commonly associated with the European Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. With its growth, feudal system had been declining and disappearing in that continent. This transformation had tremendous socio-economic and political implications and impact. Capitalism was expanding and gaining strength. Industrialization was pushing workers to increasing disadvantage and sufferings under the intense exploitation of the industrialists. During the early stages of capitalist industrialization, common person was completely at the mercy of the market forces. Under the powerful market forces, common people were treated like cattle. This exploitation was so rampant that even women and children were not spared and were treated like animals. In these circumstances, many well-meaning people that included social and political leaders and thinkers of the 19th century felt deeply and morally concerned about exploitative character of capitalism. It was in this context that even before Marx, the idea of socialism in its different variations was already being conceived as an alternative to capitalist exploitation and dehumanization. But it was Marx who propounded the most comprehensive and influential brand of socialism. He was first to most systematically and scientifically illustrate the exploitative, dehumanizing, and alienating character of the capitalist industrial society. Marx was able to penetrate through the complex implications of the capitalist system more effectively than anyone else had been able to do. Along with the objective conditions created by growth of capitalism, Marx at the intellectual level was greatly influenced by Hegel. During the 19th century, intellectually, Hegel reigned supreme in Europe. As mentioned earlier, Marx from his younger days in Germany had come under the influence of the Hegelian thought. His thought was a craze in Germany in the first half of the 19th century. His intellectual influence had even travelled beyond Germany into other parts of Europe. Karl Marx agreed with Hegel that history is a process, but disagreed about the nature of that process. Hegel interpreted human history in terms of the primacy of ideas and consciousness. Marx accepted the developmental aspect of Hegelian dialectics, but he did not agree with Hegelian view that it was ideas or the spirit which provided the driving force in history. Instead, Marx explained the historical process in terms of primacy to the material forces. Marx asserted that it is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. Marx borrowed the concept of dialectics from Hegel and applied it to his own conception of the primacy to material forces. Therefore, in his interpretation of history, Hegelian dialectical idealism becomes dialectical materialism. Therefore, Marx claims to have turned Hegel upside down and set him right side up. In addition to the Hegelian tradition, Marx was also impacted and influenced by other European traditions of enlightenment, the rationalist, the scientific, and humanist. It was combination of all these influences and traditions that went into the making of Karl Marx and his philosophy. It is the mix of the four traditions referred above that have shaped the nature of Marxian thought. Like most of the thinkers, Karl Marx evolved through different stages. For instance, in the early stages of his thought, Marx was deeply influenced by the humanist tradition. What bothered him above all in the new industrial capitalism of the mid-19th century was that it created conditions that led to the alienation of man in society. He recognized that alienation was not a peculiar condition of a capitalist society, but he asserted that alienation in capitalist society was of a different order than in all earlier societies. The theory of alienation was developed by Karl Marx in Economic and Philosophic manuscript of 1844. It deals with the experiences of workers under capitalism and not with the experiences of human beings in general. The word alienation refers to a separation or a taking away of human beings from themselves and from their potentialities. Marx refers to 6 different aspects of alienation of workers during the productive activity. These 6 aspects are closely related to one another. The most conceptually simple aspect of alienation and in some sense the conceptual starting point of the theory of alienation is the worker's alienation from his or her product. Under capitalism, a worker's product does not belong to the worker. It belongs to the capitalist who employs the worker. This objectification of the worker's creative activity, the part of his or her being, is taken from his or her control or alienated. In his early life, Marx was closely identified with a group of philosophers known as the Young Hegelians, who sought a revolutionary meaning in Hegel's philosophy. But this earlier phase in Marx's thought lasted for a very short time. During this period, Marx wrote a number of monographs, such as Critique of Hegel's Doctrine of the State, a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and more importantly in Paris, he wrote the critical commentaries on classical economics and idealist philosophy that became known as the Economic and Philosophic manuscript of 1844. In this short and unfinished text, he argued that capitalist society creates a condition of alienation. Marx's influence and reputation as a great thinker rests on the second and revolutionary phase of his thought, which began towards the middle of 1840s. This phase also marked his meeting with Friedrich Engels, with whom he developed a lifelong political and intellectual partnership and comradeship. Friedrich Engels was a German social thinker, author, political theorist, and philosopher. Engels became involved in the intellectual, political, and economic ferment then sweeping Europe and got associated with the revolutionary working class movement. He first met Karl Marx in 1942 in Paris. Together they soon produced The Holy Family, in which the ideas of the young Hegelians were rejected. In place of their idealism and liberalism, the two developed and adopted materialism and communism. However, Marx was opposed to mechanical materialism, which defined man only in terms of influences and minimized his active conscious side. Marx attacked the one-sided and deterministic character of materialist philosophy in his thesis on Feuerbach. On being expelled from Paris in 1945, Marx went to Brussels. There he, along with Engels, wrote the German ideology, which developed the criticism of the young Hegelians, and it also gave the initial account of the materialistic conception of history. The materialist conception of history was further elaborated in The Poverty of Philosophy, which is an attack on earlier notions of socialism that Marx described as utopian. A more clear and concise statement of the theory of class struggle, revolution and socialism was presented in the Communist Manifesto. In a series of lectures delivered to workers and published under the title Wage, Labor and Capital, Marx argued that under capitalism, the working class were exploited that completely impoverished them. In May 1949, Marx moved to London, where he settled for the rest of his life. Here he wrote two important texts on the class struggle in France and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. During this period, he remained active in Communist League also. The year 1850 brought certain degree of stability to Europe. In the changed context, Marx turned from political writing of day-to-day relevance to a more comprehensive study of the economic foundation of modern capitalism. Some of this remained unfinished at his death. In 1858, he completed a draft of a massive study of economics, Grand Treatise. A section of it was published as part of a contribution to the critique of political economy. Some years later, much of the material got incorporated into the Das Kapital. The Grand Treatise is a major text. It establishes continuity between the Paris manuscript and the Capital, and emphasizes the concept of alienation in the analysis of economic and social relations. The theories of surplus value, which is a long and detailed analysis of theories of value, was left unfinished. In 1867, Marx's most important work, the first volume of Capital, was published, which remained incomplete due to his ill health and the pressure of political work. Marx was the first leading figure in the First International, founded in 1864, and was also associated with the workers' uprising in Paris in 1871, which led to the founding of the short-lived Paris Commune. The uprising was analyzed by him in the Civil War in France. Marx died in 1883. And after his death, Friedrich Engels compiled and edited his incomplete writings. The rough drafts of the second and third volumes of Capital were revised and published by Engels in 1885 and 1894. Now, conclusion. Dear students, this was a brief sketch of Marx's very eventful life. Marx was one of the most powerful thinkers who understood the havoc which capitalism had brought about. He was also keen to transform society on human lines. His search was essentially for a human social order. He brought into light the dilemmas of society, working on the principles of profit, competition, and laissez-faire. He pointed out that the source of misery and alienation lay in the capitalist system working on these principles. Through his lifelong devotion to the development of the revolutionary theory, Karl Marx developed a system of revolutionary philosophy that made him probably the most influential in modern history. However, we also need to note that What we refer as Marxism or Marxist includes strong and significant political and intellectual contribution of Friedrich Engels also. Engels and Marx are rightly regarded as the co-founders of scientific socialism, generally known as Marxism. Together, the two authored a number of books fundamental to development of Marxism. The main tenets of Marxism are dialectical materialism, historical materialism, class struggles and the role of state, theory of revolution. With these words, dear students, I conclude this lecture. Hope you find this lecture useful and informative. I will meet you again with a new topic. Till then, goodbye and God bless you.